Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Janek Gryta. I'm a historian at the University of Bristol. I wanted to talk very briefly today about the transnational memory work in Schindlers Factory in Kraków, in Poland. Schindlers Factory is a Holocaust museum. Some of you might have actually seen it. It's an interesting case study because it's a very much global museum. It was created with input of global activists, but it's also a local museum which was largely set in the local circumstances. And today I want to talk about the limits of cosmopolitan memory in this presentation. And I titled this presentation as such not because I want to somehow dismiss the idea of cosmopolitan memory, rather because I want to draw your attention to the fact that it's always an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process which is very much rooted in local circumstances, local limitations, and also global limitations. Cosmopolitan memory is obviously this idea which, very briefly, focuses on multi-ethnic representations, dismantles the otherness, and quite often also looks at the suffering inflicted by the group as opposed to only the suffering inflicted on the group. In case of Eastern Europe, there is quite a lot of interesting research which shows how cosmopolitan memory has been brought from the West, and there is a little bit of research on the universalized, Americanized representations which are somehow being imported here. There is also some research which counters those ideas, which shows local roots of cosmopolitanism, but this is very much looking at the post-Cold War period. And in my presentation, I want to somehow speak to both of those trends. On the one hand, I want to show that in this case, the project came from local activists, and interestingly, was actually carried by supranational activists. So a little bit the other way around that we would normally present. And also interestingly, this project is very much rooted in the pre-1899 exhibitions. And so the cosmopolitanism in Kraków is a very much local idea which is down to the history of communist Poland. I will start the presentation from talking briefly about the exhibition that never was, quite paradoxically maybe. I want to draw your attention to one of the documents which the curators of the exhibition authored in 2008 when they have first started to talk about that exhibition. Back then they have wrote that the aim of the exhibition is to show the history of Kraków at a time when it was the capital of the non-government. This history will be presented through the stories of people, Poles, Jews, Germans, their daily life, attitudes, choices, tragedies. And I'm bringing this to your attention because I in particular want to focus on the fact that the main goal of that exhibition was to move away from three stereotypes. We're abandoning here a stereotypical representation of Poles as heroes and kind of historic representation of Polish history, instead to look into choices and tragedies. We're moving away in this exhibition from representation of Jews as the other on the margins of the main story, and we're moving away from the representation of Germans as only one-dimensional, bloodthirsty murderers. It's very important for me to highlight that this document assumed to very well exhibit the information about the German crimes in Kraków. That was very, very visible there. It was one of the main topics of the exhibition. But there would be more. There would be more information about essentially what led some Germans during those times to be the killers and ruthless occupiers they became. Importantly also, there was no any kind of equivalency between Polish and Jewish suffering in this document. To the contrary, the Polish suffering was very much different than the Jewish suffering during the Holocaust. Those were two separate stories, yet somehow linked together in space of the exhibition. If you have ever seen that exhibition that is currently in Schindlers Factory, you know that it is actually it is a slightly different exhibition to the one originally planned. And so the current exhibition that can be viewed there is quite similar. It is rooted in this original idea, but there are quite big market differences. So on the one hand, what was retained the focus on the Polish Jewish society. Here the exhibition talks about Krakowians and Poles, very much stretching those ideas, showing that to be Polish, to be a Krakowian, can mean also to be Jewish at the same time. This is a very important point from the point of view of cosmopolitan memory, because it is very much opening a representation of the past to this kind of multi-ethnic dimension. It's abandoning the othering. It's moving towards some kind of more nuanced historical representation. However, the way it's done, and this is something that is quite curious to me, is that there is a complete, almost lack of mentions of Polish anti-Semitism. So the way the exhibition insists that Krakowians, Poles, can be both of Jewish and Polish ethnicity is through completely erasing the past of Polish anti-Semitism throughout the exhibition quite systematically, even in the pre-war sections of that exhibition where this could have quite easily been done. Another thing that have changed here in comparison to the original idea was that we have moved from the representation of the history of Kraków from 3 points of view, Polish, Jewish, German, to one. Now the visitors only see the history from the point of view of victims, and they only see the public face of perpetrators. So there is no story of behind the scenes of German occupation here. Interestingly, there is a little bit more to Germans than just kind of most obvious story of the crimes, which is obviously the main topic, but there is a little bit more here. So there is a difference, for example, when compared to representations such as the one from Warsaw Magic Museum, which is pretty one-dimensional, in my opinion. In the last couple of minutes now, I want to focus on the history of this move from the first very cosmopolitan, very bold idea to the one that we actually can see today in the museum. And this comes down to this kind of memorial competition that played out in those couple of years. Typically, you would expect that the more conservative ideas were the Polish ones, and the more cosmopolitan ideas were the ones coming from outside of Poland. That could be, according to some of the research, and that already is there in the field. However, in this case, the situation is slightly different. The force fostering the pushing for cosmopolitanization is actually local curators. These were the people who originally authored the first document, and these were the people who wanted to embrace as much cosmopolitan values as possible. And importantly, this was not just a fad in 2008. This is actually a long-standing mission of the museum. And I want to draw your attention here to two exhibitions which are quite important for us here from the early 80s. The Old Synagogue and the Eagle Pharmacy. Those were initially independent institutions, eventually merged into one, and there are quite strong institutional but also individual links between the teams who prepared those 1980s exhibition and the team that worked on the exhibition in the 2000s. Those early exhibitions, we cannot call them cosmopolitan in the current meaning of the word. What they were doing, however, was focusing on the Jewish suffering, was moving away from some of the stereotypes widespread at that time. And so essentially the curators back then in the 80s have set the path. It would be impossible for curators in 2008 to talk about the Jewish, the Polish, German past the way they talked, if not for the people from the early 80s. There is a very clear path here. Another party which competed in this competition for meaning of the past in 2000 were obviously Polish politicians, and as you can expect, these people were typically pushing for ethno-nationalists and nationalism representations. Indeed, one of the city councillors went as far as to redesign the Schindlers Factory building so that his ideas could be implemented slightly better. Third party coming to the competition are representatives of the Yad Vashem, and these were obviously very strongly supporting the focus on victims. Not surprisingly, that is very much Yad Vashem's agenda. Interestingly for us, that pressure coming from Yad Vashem was used against the pressure from local politicians. Curators quite deftly laid those parties against each other, ultimately abandoning those ideas coming from local politicians to focus more on the suffering of the victims here. And the party that contributed in the greatest way, I think, to the final shape of the exhibition is actually the head of the Association of Cracowians in Israel. This is the kind of institution that typically we could credit with spread of cosmopolitanism. It's a transnational NGO, it's an NGO reaching across the borders, so the kind of institution that we would very often see as an institution spreading cosmopolitan values. However, here, it doesn't. It was actually that person's idea to move away from telling the story of the Germans in Kraków and how they have became what they became, rather to just seeing the public face of the perpetrators, as she kept referring to that. And so it was her idea to move back to those older stereotypes and abandon some of this very bold cosmopolitan interpretation. Equally at the same time, she talked about Krakowians as Poles and Jews, Krakowians of both ethnicities. And so in some ways, she has actually supported the Cosmopolitan project. So ultimately, what I wanted to mention here today is, very briefly, is that Cosmopolitan memory work is this complex process which roots very often go into places that we would not suspect. In this particular case, we can see that there are very strong links to the cosmopolitan, to the communist past, and to the memory work done under communism. But also we can see that the organizations which we would stereotypically like to imagine as the force for cosmopolitanization are actually countering those efforts. So this story of limits and of cosmopolitan development is slightly more complex than we often tend to imagine. Thank you.